Okay, students, so this is Biosafety and Bioethics. The course code is BCHM-315. This is lecture 5, and the topic is the concept of bioethics. I am Dr. Musaddiq Ibrahim, Assistant Professor, Department of Chemistry, Cohort Ministry of Science and Technology. And you can access this lecture by logging into your KCMS account, and from there you can find the relevant link which will lead you to the Quest Media Server portal, which is ms.cohort.edu.pk. And remember that this lecture is more like a discourse of bioethics, and so you need to listen to this lecture to understand the concept of bioethics. So the topics to be discussed, they include what is bioethics, principle of non-contradiction, the consequentialism, deontology, and the virtue theory. Now, why do we need bioethics, and what is bioethics? So, many people feel the need to justify their behavior, and bioethics is there to explain that why their behavior is unacceptable. So, basically, the bioethics is the branch of ethics that studies moral values in the biomedical sciences. Now, in bioethics, we are dealing that how the scientists and health professionals, they need to behave in the biomedical sciences. Now, what is bioethics? So basically, it is an attempt to understand and justify the link between values. Values means the fundamental principles and actions. Now, moving towards that, why is bioethics important? So, it is important to realize that not everything goes or fades away. For example, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Now, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment was an ethically abusive study which was conducted between 1932 and 1972 by the United States Public Health Service and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Now, the purpose of this study was to observe the natural history of untreated syphilis. Although the, the African American men who participated in the study were told that they were receiving free health care from the federal government of the United States, but practically they were not getting any cure. Okay, the next thing is Nazi human experimentation. So, what was Nazi human experimentation? That it was a series of medical experiments on a large number of prisoners, including children, by the Nazi Germany in its concentration camps in the early to the mid of 1940s. During the World War II, And the Holocaust, the chief target, uh, the populations of including Romani, Sinti, ethnic, Polish, Soviet prisoners of war, disabled Germans, and Jews from across the Europe. Now, the Nazi physicians and their assistants, they forced the prisoners into participating in this study, and the participants, they did not willingly volunteer, and along with it, no consent was given for the procedures by the participants. So these were the forced participants, and typically the experiments were conducted without giving anesthesia, and mostly resulted in death, trauma, sometimes disfigurement, or even permanent disability. So, and these are considered examples of medical torture. So, at Auschwitz and other camps, under the direction of Edward, selected inmates were subjected to various experiments that were designed to help German military personnel in combat situations, to develop new weapons, aid in the recovery of military personnel who had been injured, and to advance the Nazi racial ideology and eugenics. For example, including the twin experiments of Joseph Mengele and Heribert Heim, who conducted similar medical experiments at Mauthausen. Now, after the World War II, these crimes were tried at what became known as the doctor's trial, and revulsion at the abuses perpetrated led to the development of the Nuremberg Code of Medical Ethics. The Nazi physicians in the doctor's trial argued that the military necessity justified these experiments, and compared their victims to collateral damage from Allied bombings. So you can see that how much bioethics is important to be in practice and implemented. Otherwise, these type of things, these are horrible. Another example is TGN 1412 trial. So did something go wrong? So TGN is abbreviation for a drug which is known as theralizumab, and in its first human clinical trials, it caused catastrophic systemic organ failures in the subjects, despite being administered at a supposed subclinical dose of zero point 0.1 milligram per kg of the body weight, which was some 500 times lower than the dose found safe in animals. So, six volunteers were hospitalized on the 13 March 2006, and at least four of these suffering from multiple organ dysfunction. Now, the tentative opinions from an uncompleted inquiry suggest that the problems resulted from unforeseen biological action in human rather than breach of trial protocols, and the case therefore has had important ramifications for future trials of potentially powerful clinical agents. So here you can see that the patients were suffering, they were dying, their organs were like damaged because of this drug. So that's why the bioethics principles need to be implemented. Another one is Dr. Shipman. So Dr. Shipman was an English general practitioner who is believed to be one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. Now, in 2000, he was found guilty of the murder of 15 patients under his care. His total number of victims was approximately 250, and Shipman was sentenced to life imprisonment with the recommendation that he never be released. He died by suicide, hanging himself in his cell in West Yorkshire in 2004, a day before his 58th birthday. Now, the Shipman inquiry, which was 2 year long, investigating all the deaths which were certified by Shipman, um, examined the Shipman crimes. The inquiry identified that 218 victims and estimated his total victims counts to be 250, so about 80% of whom were elderly women. Now, the Shipman's youngest confirmed victim was a 41-year-old man, although there are doubts that he had killed patients as young as 4-year-old, and he is the only British doctor to have been found guilty of murdering his patients, although other doctors have been acquitted of similar crimes of convicting or lesser charges. So that's how like the bioethics is important, that the rules, the regulations, ethical applications need to be implemented, to be followed, so that these types of events uh, they may not, should not occur in the history, in the society. And these were some of the examples which I gave you to understand that due to the absence of bioethics within the scientific community, or within the industries, or pharmaceutical industries, or um, clinical trials, so it led to horrible consequences. Now, moving on towards the bioethics and environmental ethics. So, both the bioethics and environmental ethics, they have developed a significant momentum in the last quarter of 20th century, and they are increasingly considered to be inseparable. So it means that both the bioethics and environmental ethics, they are merged together, and their implementation, their applications, their advantages, both are uh, interrelated to each other. Now, we are going to mention some key resources in bioethics. So, Journal of Medical Ethics, that is a very prominent journal which publishes its articles about medical ethics. The bioethics, Cambridge Quarterly of Healthcare Ethics, Hastings Center Report. These are the reports which give you insight about the bioethics being followed or being implemented. American Journal of Bioethics, again, it has articles about bioethics. Journal of Agriculture and Environmental Ethics, that is dealing with the ethical issues of agriculture and environmental politics, ethics and the environment, so how both of them are connected together. And also the Journal of Public Health Ethics, which has a new version in 2008. So these are all the also the Journal of Animal Ethics. So this is also related to bioethics, that how you will implement, you will follow the bioethical rules, regulations, principles, theories, so that there is no harm, there is no danger, there is no catastrophe taking place in the society, in the biomedical place, in the industry. So these are good sources for learning and understanding. Now there are two dimensions in which the bioethics it can be observed or it can be uh, practiced. So one is the law and the professional guidelines which are given, and by following them you can uh, implement the bioethics. The second one is the reflection. So the reflection means that by following the law and professional guidelines, what is happening as a result. So to see the end result and then to observe the result, so that is known as the reflection. And if it is good and it is human friendly and it is not biased, then it means that this is working. Now how does this works? So how does it work is that by establishing knowledge for the relevant legal and professional guidelines. So you need to have the knowledge by which you can uh, add it to the legal and professional guidelines. So for example, if it is about the pharmaceutical industries and we are talking about the bioethical issues, so first of all we need to have the knowledge about the issues, and then based on the knowledge we can devise the relevant legal and professional guidelines, and exercise your ability to reflect. So once the guidelines are in place, then you need to exercise your ability to reflect to those guidelines by following them. How? That is by following them, by practicing them, and that is how the bioethics will be implemented in that specific section or industry or society. Now, there are a range of tools, like theoretical tools, which need to be followed. First one is principle of non-contradiction. The second ones are the analogies, and the third one is the thought experiments, and we will discuss them one by one. Now, the first one is principle of non-contradiction. So, a researcher who is carrying out the research on patients, for example, with advanced dementia, he says the following: that I believe that the researchers who want to carry out research on patients should only proceed if the patients give their voluntary, informed consent to the research participation. So, when the patient is giving the consent, either in the written form or verbal form, but it is a voluntary consent and informed consent, that what will happen as a result of this research experimentation. So then the patient can go under experimentation. Now the analogies. So for example, when a research project is likely to kill human research subjects, the research should not proceed. That is like a normal rationale behind a research project. Now, when a research project is likely to kill non-human research subjects, the research should not proceed. So we need to see the analogy between these two statements. So is this a valid analogy? If it is a valid analogy, why? Now, if it is not a valid analogy, why not? So that is the basics of understanding the bioethics in terms of analogies and discussing them, having a discourse on them, and then finally reaching to a decision which will become the guideline. Now about the thought experiments. So these are the thought experiments which are carried out and then assessed on the basis of rationale. So for example, imagine the explosion of a nuclear reactor leaving your 1-year-old child exposed to the nuclear fallout. Now, numerous children they develop leukemia, including your own, and the bone marrow can now be generated more successfully by reprogramming brain cells, which are more resistant to the radiation damage than bone marrow. Now, the condition is that unfortunately, a whole brain must be destroyed. The extracted stem cells could be reprogrammed to treat 10 children. So it means that the one children brain needs to be destroyed or needs to be operated so that the stem cells they can be extracted, they can be reprogrammed, and then they can be injected to the 10 children to treat them. So it is 1 out of 10. Now the thought here is since a 1 in an 11 chance of certain that seems preferable to 100% chance of imminent death. Now the question is, the thought experiment is, would you enter your child into a lottery and risk a 1 out of 11 chance of your child being sacrificed by being killed or treat others? Or the thought experiment is that to refrain from entering your child into such a lottery, which will mean that the certain death for your child. So this is the reference from bioethics, the embryonic stem cells lottery, and the cannibalization of human beings. So this is the thought experiment which is to be observed, to be focused on, and then based on the rationale you lead to a conclusion, and then based on that conclusion the bioethical values, the bioethical guidelines are then designed. Now there are some ethical theories like consequentialism, deontology, virtue theory, and principlism. Now the consequentialism. So it is about good, that what is likely to produce better than bad consequences. Other portion is bad, that what is likely to produce worse than good consequences. So for example, utilitarianism is that good is what produces the greatest utility, usually understood in terms of happiness for the greatest number of people or members. Now this is often used for resource allocation issues. How can we promote the largest amount of happiness with limited resources? And the example is Savulescu's thought experiment, which is a very good read, and I recommend you to read that. Now, in case of consequentialism, there are certain problems. Now, what are those problems? Now, can we know the likely consequences of our actions? Is it possible that we take an action for better good? So, do we know that what will be the consequences? And what if there is great uncertainty? So, if you are doing something for good and the result or the conclusion comes out bad, or it's not clear that what will happen. So, these are the problems. Impartial moral theory. Some would say that we have a duty to be partial. So, in case of doing good, the people they have different types of opinions. So some people will say that you need to be partial. So this is a problem. Certain rules may be ignored, yet some forms of consequentialism take some deontological principles into consideration. So it means that within consequentialism, the deontology is also like interrelated, or it is connected to consequentialism. So this is a problem that consequentialism is not separate from deontology in some cases. Now moving towards the deontology. So it is from the Greek word which is used for duty, and the rules which express our duties. So that is the basic of deontology. For example, killing someone to give their organs to someone else, so may ignore our duty to respect that person's right to life. This is an example. Now, in deontology, there are some problems. So, for example, always following rules of conduct can lead to negative consequences, as we gave the example in the last slide, that you need to kill somebody to take out his or her organs and give it to another person who is suffering or who is sick. So, for example, here the problem is that allowing a massive bomb to explode by refusing to torture someone. So, like, you are not touching someone, but you are allowing a massive bomb to explode. Or, for example, not fabricating a research result might mean admitting that your study found nothing. That is interesting. So, like, when you are following your duty, or you are doing the rules of conduct, then you might have some problems, as given here. Now, another theory is the virtue theory. So, what is the virtue? So, in case of virtue theory, you are focusing on the agent of action rather than on the rules or consequences. So, you have a role model who has, like, the action, showing practical example, and by following that, you are not concerned about the rules or the consequences, but you are following a role model as a manifesto of action. Now, the problems may arise in case of following the virtue theory, that it may fail to guide our actions, as there are no clear golden rules that can be applied. So, what is virtue might virtue be wise. So, what is virtue is the quality of doing what is right and avoiding what is wrong. But who knows that this may lead to moral weakness. Now, these are the references which were like followed and consulted, and you can go for further understanding of the bioethics by um, reading these books. The serial number 5 book, which is titled Bioethics and Biosafety in Biotechnology by V.S. Krishna. So that is a good book for a good read. Thank you.